Hello everyone, my name is Antony Cummins and I'm a historical researcher and author, and I want to talk to you today about ground fighting and does it really work. Now I know full well there's an argument on the internet that's raged for many years is what's best, ground fighting versus stand-up fighting, and which is superior. Now, I don't want to get involved in that argument, ladies and gentlemen. That's not what I'm here for. So I'm not like, yay, let's ground fight, or hey, let's not ground fight. Not at all. What I'd like to do is, my aim in life is to correct the very distorted samurai history. And I know in, ground fighting, I know the Gracie families and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu have really sort of like, they're the pinnacle stars of this, that type of thing. So what I want to do is remind people about the historical angle of this. Now, of course, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu comes from Japan, and I think it started with Fusenryu, or around Fusenryu times, and who were an amazing school going around and ground fighting and grappling people, which was excellent. But what I want to do is try to hopefully educate you in a nice way about the history of samurai and ground fighting. So when people say which is best, ground fighting or stand-up fighting, the problem you've got when people try to mix it with history is they put it into the Edo period. Now, for those of you who've come from the MMA community and maybe not fully au fait with Japanese history, in short, you've got two main periods that we're interested in. There are many periods, but two main ones. You've got the Sengoku period, or the warring periods, and then you've got the Edo periods. Now, in Edo period, which is when Fusenryu, really got going, at the end of the Edo period, you've got people challenging each other to one-on-one matches, to jiu-jitsu matches, to sword fights, things like that, but it's more of a one-on-one, rough sport combat, if you will. Even in samurai times, it was more of a rough sport combat, and who was the best ground fighter, who was the best at locking, and with wooden sticks we could batter each other, which is all very good. And you see the MMA fights and people are bleeding, and they're fit lads. But what I want to remind you of is when you're arguing about the groundwork versus standing up fighting, and you talk about samurai and things like that, is in samurai times, this idea of stand-up fighting or ground fighting did not really exist in the way you think it did. So you will find it very difficult to go back to old systems of samurai warfare, like schools, and you'll find it very difficult to find a punch, a kick, or striking, really. While you need striking, what you find is most things you strike people with a big sword or a big knife or a big hammer. You very rarely hit them with your fists. Even samurai right now have a last dagger to kill with. You've got a dagger. So imagine when you're talking about historical fighting, the minimum you're going to have is a 6-inch blade to knife people with. So there wasn't this, if it was ground fighting, it was ground fighting with a knife. There was very, very rarely any ground fighting, locking and all that. While it did exist, it was a rarity, and you almost hardly ever find kicking and punching in traditional samurai warfare. So when you argue about this, guys, I want you to remember that actually it's not based in samurai warfare itself. So let me give you an example. I wrote this book called Samurai War Stories, and this is a translation with my translation team, and these are not techniques but stories and skills about how the samurai used to fight. And one of the stories tells of a great samurai who was massive, and he worked in teams, like all samurai work in teams. I'll tell you that more in a minute. Now, he would come out with a big rake, a massive, imagine a big stick. He's got his katana, he's got his tanto, which is his knife in his belt, and he's got this big piece of hardwood with a big iron claw on the end, and when people are running past him on the battlefield, he claws them, rips them back, and his friends who are stood by the side of him cut their heads off and stab them, or hold them down and saw through their necks, yeah? And then he'll go out and get the next one. Now, in this particular story, this gentleman, this samurai, took 10 heads this way before he himself was killed. And so what you've got to remember from this is that, one, you've always got weapons. Two, you've actually always got teammates. So imagine, if you will, for mixed martial arts, it would be 2 or 3 people in in the cage together. It would be an all-out thing. So what often happened is a samurai would come on and he'd have a servant with him. Now the servant was battle trained as well, sometimes, or he may have a lower ranking samurai with him. And the idea was that he would fight, and they became side spear, and they would become the side aid. So they may spear from the sides while he chops or spears from the front, and they'd all come in. And sometimes you get the two people who'd grapple and go to the ground with the guy, while the other man got on top of him. He would get his wakizashi out, or his tanto, the short sword, and saw through his neck while he was still alive, and he's absolutely sawing it, pulling it off, while the other two are holding the body down. That's one of the skills. Sorry, right, I lost my train of thought. Right, okay, so what you've got to remember is that if you're going to put MMA and try and argue about ground fighting, you've got to put a few weapons in there, and you've got to put a few people in there, and you've got to start cutting heads off. So please be aware, guys, and my only aim in this video is simply the fact that people argue, or they've started to say samurai warfare is not so great, traditional martial arts is not great. So there's a bit of an English argument here, an English language argument, because they say traditional martial arts do not work in the ring because ground fighting works better from Brazil. First of all, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is from Japan. It's based in something called Fusen Ryu, and other things, but generally it's Japanese, and it comes from a period of peace which was more about, you know, fighting, that type of fighting where it was civilian fighting, not military fighting. And then you've got to remember that the samurai of the time were not actually doing that. I've got manuals here, and we are publishing them in something called Nato-Ryu. If you want to know about real samurai warfare, I'll put the links below. Follow us, called Natori-Ryu, and there we're publishing books on it all. Now what it says in there is get off the ground, get off the ground. Don't get on the ground, simply because you're going to get murdered in a battlefield. And it talks about when you're actually fighting someone, if someone's massive, it says don't grapple them, cut them down with a sword, or if they're overly big, you retreat with a longbow, the Japanese longbow of course, and then you longbow into them, or you take your friends with guns and you shoot them because they're so big and muscly and strong, you just murder them and from a distance. Or if they're good at fighting with such a weapon, change weapons to this. So what I'm trying to say is a real samurai talks about this, and he says, so I get off the ground, and if they're massive and these big chaps, shoot them. That's how you kill them. You don't fight them. That's a ridiculous idea. So if somebody's massive, kill them with a knife or a sword. That's the point of samurai warfare. So I hope you've enjoyed that, guys. I'm sorry for rambling on a bit, but my point here is that please keep, in all the argument between ground fighting and stand-up fighting, please remember that in the original samurai schools, where a lot of this came from, most of it was done with weapons or friends at hand. That's how it was done. It was only later it started to become duel type things. Of course, there's lots of detailed layers in all history. You could debate lots of things, but that's the overall basics. So, what do you think? Is ground fighting good because it's only good one-on-one? Should you learn less punching and kicking, and should you learn more weapons? Please leave your comments in the links below. Remember that please don't turn this into a ground fighting versus standing fighting. That's the entire point of my video, is to say that that's not a real argument. That's a modern idea. Let's talk about how the samurai used to do it. How good is it to get on the ground with people and arrows and guns going off around you? So that's my video, guys. My name's Antony Cummins. If you want to follow me, I'm on Facebook. I'll put the links below. If you want to know any more about the ninja, you want to get this. This is the Book of Ninja, which is written in 1676, and it was actually written by a real ninja, so you can follow what the ninjas did then.